much less sanction against going out having affairs and other forms of release. But if your only release is can be with your spouse, then your spouse has tremendous power over you.
Exactly. I want to shift gears a little bit and go to Chief Rabbi Sachs.
Yes.
Because he's got his classic way of looking at things. And it's always sort of the big picture. And he takes this parsha and looks at the religious significance of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So he sees the long journey is nearing its close. The Jordan is almost within sight. And then God tells Moses, take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. And this, according to Nachmanides, is the source of the command to dwell in the land of Israel and inherit it. And with this, we come to one of the central tensions in Judaism and Jewish history. What is the religious significance of the land of Israel? Its centrality cannot be doubted. Whatever the subplots and subsidiary themes of the Torah, its overarching narrative is the promise of and journey to the land. Jewish history begins with Abraham and Sarah's journey to it. Exodus to Deuteronomy are taken up with a second journey in the days of Moses. The Torah as a whole ends with Cyrus, king of Persia, granting permission to Jews exiled in Lebanon to return to their land, the third great journey. And the great paradox of Jewish history is that though a specific territory, the Holy Land, is at its heart, Jews have been spent more time in exile than in Israel, more time longing for it than dwelling in it, more time traveling than arriving. Much of the Jewish story could be written in the language of today's Sedra. They journeyed from X and camped at Y. So how do you deal with this paradox? On the one hand, we're obligated to live in the land of Israel, but on the other hand, we're in exile, and God is everywhere. So how do you deal with this tension?
Well, I think like with the rest of Judaism, there are ideals, but if you can't live up to the ideal, it doesn't mean you chuck the whole thing. Like if you can't give 10% of your income to charity, doesn't mean you don't give 8% if you can give 8%. It's not all or nothing. If, let's say, you can't send all your children to Jewish day school, one has special needs that can only be provided for at a secular school, it doesn't mean you say, oh, kids, you might as well all go to public school. And if you break down and break the Sabbath one's Shabbat, it's not like, oh, I might as well give up being religious.
But that assumes that one is higher than the other. And
well,
here,
certainly living in the land of Israel. Do you have any doubt
sure,
that
but
that's
look
the
at what
ideal?
he says.
Okay.
On the one, monotheism must understand God as non-territorial. That's one of the fundamental aspects of monotheism. God is non-territorial. The God of everywhere could be found anywhere.
Yeah, but
right?
he can be found anywhere, but he still has a special relationship with the land of Israel, just as God is God to all people,
right.
But he has a chosen people.
Right. So how do you explain the Lubavitcher Rebbe never moving to Israel or never even visiting Israel?
I don't think he lived up to the ideals of Judaism. I think it's very clear that Judaism is meant to be lived and practiced in a specific place, the land of Israel, that this land is holy and special to God in a way that no other land is. And I think there is definitely a kedusha to the land of Israel. It demands a higher moral level if you want to stay there. If you don't stay there and keep things up at a high level, you get kicked out.
Right, but who's holier? A child molester living in Israel or a holy Jew living in exile?
A holy Jew living in exile. But the question is, who's holier? Take equally holy people, one in Israel and one in Los Angeles. There's no doubt that the person in Israel, all other things being equal, is doing a holier thing.
Here's how he talks about it. Okay. He says, the sages formulated the tension in two striking propositions. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they quote from Mechilta Bo 14, wherever the Israelites went into exile, the divine presence was exiled with them. But on the other hand, one who leaves Israel to live elsewhere is as if he had no God. And that comes from Ketubot 1:10. Can one find God, serve God, experience God outside the Holy Land?
Of course.
And he said yes and no.
Okay.
If the answer was only yes, there would be no incentive to return. But if the answer were only no, there would be no reason to stay Jewish in exile. On this tension, the Jewish existence is built.
Say that again. What's his solution? Yes.
There's no solution. He says, can one find God, serve God, experience God outside the Holy Land? He said the answer is not yes or no. The answer is yes and no. If the answer was only yes, there would be no incentive to return.
Mm-hmm.
But if the answer were only no, there would be no reason to stay Jewish here in Pico Robertson. And on this tension, the Jewish existence is built.
Right. Yeah, that's good. But the ideal is you live in Israel. I mean, do you have any doubts that that's a Jewish ideal? That we should be living in Israel?
I think the yearning. Someone once told me that there's an obligation to constantly yearn to live in Israel. That alone was a mitzvah. That you always have to. You can't treat it casually and just say, okay, the ideal, and then that's it. I'm done, and I'm staying in L.A. That it needs to be a constant tension, a constant yearning to go back, a constant emptiness that you have inside of you. That's part of your connection to Israel. Is if you don't live there, it needs to bother you at all times, as opposed to filing it away and saying, well, that's the ideal, I'm not there, let's move on. And I think from a lot of my sort of Israel loving friends, I see that it's almost becomes part of the conversation, a constant yearning, almost a guilt trip for why we're not there.
Why don't you live in Israel?
There's no one reason. I think I feel such Jewishness in exile. I feel such Judaism in exile. There's almost a sense that exile brings out the best in me.
What is your reaction to spending time in Israel?
Well, I'm going there in a couple of weeks. There's nothing I love more than to spend time in Israel. I love it. I mean, it's actually easy for me to be in Israel because I'm bathing in the excitement and the holiness, and there's no on and off button in Jerusalem.
Right.
In LA, if you don't turn on the on button, forget it.
Right.
But you walk out of any hotel or place in Jerusalem, and you're constantly in a state of excitement, holy excitement. So there's no comparison. I don't know how I would live there, but in terms of the experience of being there, it's on a much higher
How do you think it
plane.
would affect you if you moved there? What do you think?
I think I'd be consumed with all the issues because you're consumed in Israel by just the conversations, just never end, and the people you meet are so caught up in the drama of living in this state of constant crisis, living under siege. We have so much manufactured drama. The whole country is worried about LeBron James today. And what's he going to say tonight? He's giving a whole hour tonight at 9 p.m. on which team he's going to pick.
It's getting to the Heat, Miami.
And when you go to Israel, they're worrying about some guy, blowing them up. From some crazy guy from Iran that Hezbollah is now 20,000 rockets and they might come after them. There's some severe divisions between the Sephardic, the Ashkenazi, and the Haredi, and the non, and the way religion is being coercive. All the issues are so unmanufactured. The drama in Israel is so real that you can see the minute you get there and you discuss the subjects. Whereas here we are in exile, worrying about LeBron James. So it's a constant struggle, living in exile, living in LA, to find holiness. Like the show that you're doing here is an example of what you got to do in exile. You got to go out of your way to connect with Judaism and God and Jews, out here. Whereas in Israel you don't. So you have to go out of your way not to get caught up in the LeBron James sort of balagan and emptiness. And in a way that sort of brings out the best in me. I make a greater effort. Whereas in Jerusalem, I make zero effort. Zero. It's like the meetings happen all the time. I go out, I'm in the lobby of the hotel, I meet this guy that I know. The conversations are wholly interesting, dramatic, nonstop. It just goes. Requires no effort. I go to the wall, I walk over to the wall. It's like one of the greatest moments is Friday afternoon, Friday just before Shabbat.